time out of your busy schedule on a gorgeous Sunday afternoon to be here today. Hopefully it is worth your time, and it should be an interesting tale of discovery and of two stories that really started off for me about 30 years ago, but really started hot and heavy about last March. And today we're going to talk about those stories, but the stories are about Frederick Douglass, you can see here on the right, who spoke in Dubuque, and a little bit about Douglass's presence in Dubuque in that particular photograph. We're also going to talk about a silver picture that we see right here that I purchased last March that is also related to a national military encampment that occurred in Dubuque in 1884. So we're going to talk a little bit about those stories, but today's presentation is not about the stories themselves. Today's presentation is really the path of discovery that led me to the two stories. And I wrote these two articles about both instances. We have handouts here at the end of the show. You're more than welcome to take it, look up the story online, and read the story about Frederick Douglass and his visits to Dubuque, or about the national encampment and what that was all about. But today really is about what led me to these two stories that I ended up writing. And that really was a time span of about 30 years. So today we're scheduled to go for about an hour and a half. My name's John Pregler. I am my father's son, so I'm a little bit long-winded. We may go a little bit longer depending on interactions and questions and comments. So I just wanted to give you a heads up. So today's journey, like I said, really is a journey of discovery through time and history. And we're going to be touching base on Frederick Douglass's lectures in Dubuque, and when I first started to discover and learn about that, and what that then led to. And we're also going to talk about the 1884 National Encampment here in Dubuque, Iowa, and how I started to discover about that, and over time discovered more and more information that led to this eventual article. During that time, like I said, last March, number 3 there, I ended up obtaining this silver presentation picture to the bourgeoisie of St. Louis. That was a presentation picture from the 1884 National Military Encampment here in Dubuque, Iowa. And I'm going to talk about how Samuel Root, a nationally known local Dubuque photographer, was kind of the glue that really kept on coming up as I researched information about either Frederick Douglass or about the national encampment in Dubuque. And we have some artifacts up front here today that you're more than welcome to look at. Everything here is an actual artifact with the exception of the image of Frederick Douglass that was taken in Dubuque. We have some representations or reproductions here, but we don't have the actual image. But we do have here today some actual images of the national encampment from 1884 from Samuel Root, as well as an image or sketch by Alexander Simplot, a local Dubuque artist who was very well known during the Civil War for his illustrations that appeared most often in Harper's Weekly. We have some other images of Samuel Root and some famous people that Root had photographed over his career. We also have a picture here of David Bremner Henderson, United States Congressman and eventually Speaker of the House of Representatives. Camp Henderson, which we'll be talking about here today, was named after David Henderson. So we have some artifacts here kind of related to the national encampment and to Samuel Root that we'll also talk about that were really part of this journey of discovery that we're talking about here today. That really led to these two amazing articles, or stories I should say, about Frederick Douglass and his 3 visits to Dubuque and 3 lectures in Dubuque in a 5-year span, as well as the first of its kind military encampment here in Dubuque. And these are what I call history's mysteries. So I first discovered the first bit of this information that led me on this trail back in about 1994. So this has been a long journey of discovery that has led to the telling of these stories. And there's a host of history's mysteries that revolve around Dubuque history. As a researcher and as a writer and as a historian, it's the job of the historian and the researcher to discover or rediscover history, reinterpret it, and tell it anew in light of either new information or new sensibilities of the time that we live in. And we're going to try to do a little bit of that here today, but these are a variety of, I keep a running list of history's mysteries that I've been investigating, looking for information. Right now, the next story, an article I'm working on, is related to Major Henry Rathbone, who was in the Lincoln box when Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. It is believed that he served in Dubuque for a year or two at the beginning of the war as a recruiter for the 12th U.S. Infantry. We know several hundred volunteers in the 12th U.S. Infantry mustered through Dubuque. We know they had a Dubuque office. We also know that Henry Rathbone's uncle Joel, his father's brother, was also a recruiter in Dubuque in 1862. And you can see there the quote on the right-hand side, that came from the Dubuque Daily Herald, speculating that Rathbone indeed was in Dubuque. So I'm trying to tie up some of these history's mysteries, and there's others. I'm trying to validate when Lincoln was actually in Dubuque and why he was in Dubuque. Right now it's really folklore, and everything you find, you can't find a specific citation. And that's one thing I took great care in this journey of discovery related to Frederick Douglass and Camp Henderson, is to cite multiple resources that validate the fact that this did occur on this date and this is real. And we'll talk a little bit about Camp Henderson and the local driving park and fairgrounds, and really trying to decipher where that was looking at this information. So this is just a variety of things that I've been looking at and trying to research here amongst what we're going to talk about today. And my research really started back when I was a teenager and first discovered that my great-great-grandfather served in the Civil War in an Iowa unit. So I became interested. I knew about General Grant and Galena, and I knew about the Civil War in general, but all the stories that are told about the Civil War are from an Eastern perspective. I really don't talk about those here in Iowa that served and what they did and all the Western battles. So as a kid, I started wanting to know more, so I discovered the great research potential here at Carnegie-Stout Public Library. And so I started using different resources made available here at Carnegie-Stout, both in library, and we have a gorgeous library here, and a lot of resources, as well as online through the internet. They have a lot of available resources online that even 5 years ago were not available, that are very useful and allow you to stay up all night long, lost in the internet searching stuff. And it's great, it's really wonderful. So a lot of what I've discovered really has come through or germinated here through tools and information at the public library here. Now I use a whole host of other tools, and the Dubuque County Historical Society and Mr. Gibson's Center for Dubuque History up at Loris, and a whole host of other resources, but I always find myself turning to Carnegie-Stout. And they have a great, when you go to their website, on their website they have a research link right there that then will bring up a whole host of different tools to be able to do research. So in library here, there's the microfilm room with almost 2 centuries worth of newspapers and information related to the tri-states. That's a great resource history to use. I strongly recommend it. There's also the Iowa reference section that has all the old histories written of all the counties around the tri-state area. That is a wealth of information. Most of them were written around 1870 to 1885, so it captures a lot of information that has been lost in time and is waiting to be retold. So it's very worth going in. Some of the key tools I use in my research, I love using Ancestry.com. We discovered through Ancestry.com that Oliver Shiras and George Shiras of Shiras Avenue, Oliver Shiras was the creator of Eagle Point Park. His brother George Shiras, who lived in Dubuque and was a U.S. Supreme Court justice, were relatives of the Herons that lived in Dubuque. And Francis J. Heron was a Civil War general and the first person to volunteer for the Civil War in the United States. And I discovered that they were cousins, and I laid out their relationship between the two families using the library's Ancestry.com. So it's a great resource tool to figure out family history. I've been using it to discover about the Rathbones and the relationship between Joel Rathbone and Major Henry Rathbone, because I believe they were both in Dubuque as recruiters for the 12th U.S. Infantry. I also use a variety of other tools on there, the Telegraph Herald, digital archives, as well as ProQuest historical newspapers. That's where I find most of my information, because it gives you a sense of what was going on at the time, and it gives you additional leads to start following. So newspapers are a wonderful way to learn not only tidbits of history, but also a general sense of how people lived. What was the environment? What was the mood? What were the issues of the time? What was the quality of life? And you can start putting yourself and your mind into that mindset of that time period and better understand what was going on when Frederick Douglass came to Dubuque. What was the mood of the country, and what might have been the mood of Dubuquers? So that's part of really the fascinating part of research and discovering history, to be able to tell these stories once again. So I highly recommend utilizing the tools here at Carnegie-Stout Library, whether they're online or whether they're in-house here. The other tool that is extremely valuable is the city directory. The old city directories from the 19th century, they're as much a picture book as it is a city directory with all the old advertisements. So you learn so much about the businesses that were in town and what they did and the industries that were driving the city and those types of things. And you can also see where people live and how people and locations around Dubuque and the city of Dubuque grew and migrated over time, which was one of the histories and mysteries we're going to talk about here in a moment, was discovering where the actual Camp Henderson was located in relationship to the Dubuque Driving Park and the German shooting range, and the challenge that we went through with that. But we use these types of tools to start discovering that. So now let's start talking about Frederick Douglass and the encampment a little bit. So I'm going to go through this a little bit in kind of a chronological order. So back in the mid-1990s, I was doing a bunch of research on Dubuque and the Civil War. At that time, the internet did not exist to the degree it does today. So all my research was in-house here physically at the library, going through microfilm. I've read a lot, probably miles and miles of microfilm. And I was researching a specific topic, but along the way, I discovered this little advertisement in the Dubuque Daily Herald for Frederick Douglass speaking at the Athenaeum on March 3rd, 1868. That's the first I heard that Douglass was in Dubuque. I had heard stories about Douglass speaking in Galena back in 1854 regarding the anti-slavery and the abolition movement, but I had never known that he was in Dubuque, let alone had an image or a photograph taken here in Dubuque. So I went ahead and I made a photocopy for 10 cents of this. I put it in my files and figured someday, when time permits, I'll go back and research it, or hopefully, like we do as researchers, for the researchers in the room, eventually you stumble over information, you file it away, you stumble over more information, you know it's tied to that, so you just slowly collect information until you have enough data and enough information to really start an in-depth research about what's going on. The historian and the researcher very much are detectives. And CIS shows, you know, you help the historian relax. It helps you figure out, how do I start reverse engineering this history of what really might have happened? And it kind of follows the same thought process. But this I discovered back in probably 1994, 1995, filed it away, never thought much of it. Then in about 2010, I started deciding to bring together all the information I had gathered over the prior 20 years, predominantly on the Dubuque Civil War, to bring together and make an outline, either write about it or give a speech about it. So in 2012, I gave a very well-received speech on Dubuque and the Civil War, placed quite a bit on City Channel 8, you may have seen it. After that June 2012 speech, a lady by the name of Diane Harris had approached me with this particular image she bought at a garage sale. And she was wondering if this particular image was Camp Union or Camp Franklin here in Dubuque during the Civil War. Camp Union and Camp Franklin were the same camp. It was the military mustering and drilling camp located on Romberg Avenue, where Romberg and Shiras are, where the Eagle Point apartments are currently located today. That was Camp Union. Because of the secessionist mentality and sympathies in Dubuque, they changed the name from Camp Union to Camp Franklin in 1862 because they thought Camp Union was a stretch because of the Confederate sympathies that were prevalent in Dubuque. But they were one and the same camp. So she brought this image to me wondering if this was indeed that camp, because down at the bottom it said S. Root, Artist, Sanford Block, Dubuque, Iowa. And of course you see bluffs up here. So she was wondering, is this indeed Camp Franklin? So I started looking at the image. I engaged one of the very first resources I always turn to related to Dubuque history, and that's encyclopediadubuque.org. Which is a sponsored website that was facilitated and sponsored by the library here, and it's created and run by Randy Lyon. And then I reached out to Mike, who's with us here today up at Loras College in the Center for Dubuque History, trying to figure out where exactly was this located, and was it Camp Union or Franklin? And right away we started to suspect it was Camp Henderson. I didn't know a lot about Camp Henderson at the time, so I started to do some research, and the general thought at the time was Camp Henderson was related to a National a National Guard encampment in Dubuque back in the 1800s, and it was generally believed to be on the old fairgrounds, which everybody then would say the old fairgrounds was the old Nutwood Park. Well, the old Nutwood Park was where Melody Mills or the old Wicks Lumber is, where the intersection of JFK, John Deere Road, and the Northwest Arterial is today. So we took that as, okay, this is probably at the location in Nutwood Park. So as a historian, the first thing I wanted to do was go out and align all the landscape and the bluffing and figure out, okay, where was Samuel Root when he took this image, and what was the setup? Wanting to know about the environment, not just the image itself. And so for over 2 years, I searched and could not align this out by Nutwood Park, whether I was looking east or whether I was looking west. I could not find the landscape. And it's hard to see here, but you can see different things where hills come together or valleys come together when you look closely at the picture that you can't see here. That helps you better align when you're out there. And I'd go out there in wintertime when there's no leaves, in the summertime when there were leaves, different seasons, trying to figure out or find that perfect spot. And I never did get it aligned. So I thought nothing of it. I set it aside probably in 2013, 2014. Now this is the back of the image. When Diane bought this, she bought it at a garage sale for just a couple bucks, and on the back it said, early Dubuque, Iowa photographer, Civil War encampment at Dubuque, photocopy, and then it was authenticated. But it was clearly not the Civil War. Within a year after seeing this picture, I ended up acquiring this image right here. It's actually from a July 5th, 1884 Harper's Weekly magazine. Harper's Weekly was like the Time magazine of the day. That and Frank Leslie's Illustrated. So it was a very popular paper, and it ran an article about the military maneuvers at Camp Henderson in Dubuque, Iowa. And as I started looking at this, and I started looking at the other image, things started to line up regarding the way the encampment looked and those types of things. So at that point, around 2013, 2014, I determined that Diane Harris's image indeed was Camp Henderson and not Camp Union, and it was related to the military maneuvers and military encampment at Camp Henderson. And this is the article that was in Harper's Weekly. So at this point, I wanted to know a little bit more about the National Guard encampment that year. And what I discovered was it wasn't just a National Guard encampment. As you read in here, there's an actual statement that goes, the association of detachments from the regular Army with National Guardsmen in these encampments has proved to be a very happy idea. And General Bentley has been highly complimented by officers of the former on the success of this experiment. And what that is alluding to or indicating is this was the first of its kind, in which it was the first time that state militia, or by 1884 they were calling themselves National Guards, and Federal Army got together in the same encampment and drilled and trained together and shared information. It just hadn't happened since the Civil War or the Mexican War prior to that, or the Black Hawk War prior to that. It never happened in peacetime. So this actually was an experiment in which they were bringing together, at the recommendation of General Bentley, a DuBuquer, head of the Iowa National Guard, to bring together federal units and National Guard units from across the country to share drilling information, techniques, equipment, those types of things. In 1884, National Guards had their own ways of drilling. Some still drilled with the old Civil War techniques. Some had developed more modern techniques over the last 20 years since the Civil War. Other military units were still using old Prussian military drilling techniques that were no longer in line with the day, the time, or the manner of war that was present in the 1880s and moving into the 1890s. So it turned out that it was actually a pretty big event that occurred in Dubuque, and I really didn't have a sense of how big of an event it was. Until last March, I noticed on eBay a posting. The posting was for an 1884 Civil War trophy, Bush Zouaves, 8th Missouri Infantry presentation picture. That was the heading of the item for sale on eBay. So right away I knew, because I can do some math, that 1884 was 19 years after the Civil War ended. So my first assumption was this was not Civil War related. So I decided, well, I'm going to go ahead and bid on it, because it was inscribed Dubuque, June 16, 1884. I knew that the National Encampment occurred in 1884. I just assumed that it was related, that it wasn't Civil War, that it was related to this Dubuque National Encampment. So I went ahead and bidded on the picture. Very ornate picture. It's very embossed, a lot of handwork on it. It has flowers, bees, birds. You can see when you look at the picture over here, it's a pouring pitcher. It's rather heavy, so it has a stand to be able to pour it. And the legs are of cranes, so it's very ornate. And on the front here, it has inscribed in it, first premium won by the Bush Zouaves, Dubuque, Iowa, June 16, 1884. So I ended up winning it, receiving the picture. I got it in the mail. It was a little bit bigger and heavier than I thought. Didn't know much about it. I contacted the seller to see what provenance and other information he knew about the piece. So I did a little bit of research online, discovered that it came with silver goblets, so there were cups. Did he know what happened to those? Did he know who the Bush Zouaves were? Did he have any history of the piece? And he knew nothing. He had bought a storage garage unit at an auction in Oklahoma, in a small town in Oklahoma. He was going through all the junk in the storage garage, and there was one box filled with all kinds of things unrelated to this. This just happened to be in it. He knew nothing about it, just threw it up on eBay to get rid of it, figured someone would want it. I did, so I bought it. And that really then led me into, okay, I knew I had bought this image from Harper's Weekly of the National Encampment. I knew Diane Harris had this image that we believed was also from Camp Henderson. I wanted to know more. So I really threw myself into doing the research, going through all the newspapers of the time, before, during, and after the week of the National Encampment. I pulled up that picture of Diane's. I knew it was from Samuel Root, so we started doing some additional searching for Samuel Root and Camp Henderson and Dubuque and 1884 using internet searches and search engines. And suddenly this image came up. This is another Samuel Root image of Camp Henderson. And this one looks a little bit more like the image Alexander Simplot had drawn up and was published in Harper's Weekly, because the shot is more on. And what you can see here, it's hard to see, but you can see all the tents, and I'm going to go actually to the next slide because it shows the image a little bit better. These are stereograph, the old stereo viewers. You stick the card in and it brings it together. It makes it more 3D. That's what this is. So if you bring the image together, you can see it a little bit better. So this is actually the 4th U.S. Infantry and where they camped at Camp Henderson. This is, again, the fairgrounds and the Dubuque Driving Park. This is actually the amphitheater of the horse race track, or driving park. That's what horse race tracks were called, was driving parks back in the day. And this is the tower that looked out over the horse track. But again, at this point, we still thought, okay, Nutwood Park, or if it's not Nutwood Park, where exactly was it? And you can see here that the hill comes down like that. Thank you very much, Abe. The hill comes down here, and the hill comes down here. So this is actually a valley that comes together. So I was driving up and down 52nd or Central and Highway 52 there, stopping, holding up images, trying to get things to align, going on to different map services on the internet and looking at aerial maps and looking at topology maps to try to figure out where this was located. And for the life of me, I couldn't find it. Then I discovered another image when I was down, and unfortunately, Tish Boyer was going to be here today from the Dubuque County Historical Society, who owns this image. And she was actually going to bring this image for display here today, but she is out sick. Trish is the collections manager at Dubuque County Historical Society, and a wealth of information as well. I was going through the different Root images, Samuel Root images, and I discovered this image down at the County Historical Society. And it was always believed to just be a picture of a horse race, or at a horse race. And as I looked at it, this is the amphitheater, this is the lookout tower, this is the horse track in here. But if you notice, the stands are packed. There's people down here on the horse track, and there's people out in the middle of the track. I also noticed people on top of the amphitheater, and I also noticed all these little white tents behind the amphitheater. And it didn't take long to figure out that this was also a picture of the national encampment. It wasn't a horse race, it was the national encampment. And so I looked at those images, and I then also discovered the original Samuel Root image that was the basis of the image that Diane Harris had bought at a yard sale. Cliff Cranick, and I know a couple people in the room know Cliff. Cliff owned this picture. Cliff is a nationally known 19th century expert in photography. He's one of the first people the Smithsonian turned to. And he actually had this in his collection, and we actually have it here today on display. So looking at these, it became apparent between these three images and the Alexander Simplot that all the images were related to the national encampment. So I kept on searching, well, maybe there's more Root images. So I started to do searches specifically to Samuel Root. And as I was searching for Samuel Root, another image came up in my search, in my Google search. Very much to my surprise, and it was this image here. And I'm like, well, why would there be a picture of Frederick Douglass in a search for Samuel Root? So I started to search more and dig more, and I discovered that the image was in 3 or 4 different books, published, mentioned, and each time it was credited potentially to Samuel Root. Each time it had a different year and a different date it potentially was taken, and potential suggestions as to the location that it was taken. but it was attributed to Samuel Root. So I thought, wow, this is really something. First off, it's a very gorgeous picture. And I wanted to know more. Was Frederick Douglass in Dubuque? And then it occurred to me, I still had in my files this advertisement for Frederick Douglass speaking in Dubuque that I had unearthed 20 years earlier that was in my files. So I'm like, okay, this was probably taken by Root in 1868. So I wanted to know more. So the first thing I decided to do was, who was Samuel Root? And why would there be a picture of Frederick Douglass taken by Samuel Root, and was it taken in Dubuque? Because in the different books, there was some question, was the picture taken in 1865, 1868, 1870, a year after Samuel Root died? We assume that it wasn't taken then. And there was some questions as to where it was taken. One speculated it was taken in Dubuque after Douglass gave a speech in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Well, Mount Pleasant, Iowa is 270 miles from Dubuque. There's no way he just, decided to ride up to Dubuque to have his picture taken. He was in Dubuque for a specific reason, and it wasn't because of the Mount Pleasant speech. I figured that much. But I didn't know enough about why was he here, when was he here, was it related to the speech clipping I had, those types of things. So I wanted to know more, so I decided I was going to start searching on Samuel Root. So who was Samuel Root? And one of the things we discovered was on the back of the Douglass image was written, S. Root, photographer, 166 Main Street, Dubuque, Iowa. The other picture of the National Encampment that I just showed you, it said S. Root, Sanford Block, Dubuque, Iowa, which is not the same location. One of the little things you learn in doing Dubuque history is in the early years, when they started building along Main Street, they would just start numbering each location in numerical order, regardless of what block it was along. So 166 Main Street was actually at the corner of 8th and Main. They didn't go by the 500, 600, and 700 block. I'm not sure when that changed in Dubuque. I suspect about 1870. Mike, I don't know. Do you know specifically when it changed? But it changed at some point. So you learn when you see addresses, you need to determine, what was the year, and then you need to kind of do some translation. And so there was some question as to, when and where did Root take the picture that I was curious in knowing the result. But first I wanted to know who Samuel Root was. And so in my research, it came to be discovered, this is from a well-known book about daguerreotypists, which was the style of photography at the time, daguerreotypes, daguerreographs, those types of things. And Samuel Root here and his brother Marcus Aurelius were early practitioners of photography going back to the early 1840s. Daguerre came to America and brought photography for the first time with him in 1839. John Plumb, Jr. of Dubuque, who is oftentimes considered the father of American photography, was one of the very first people to buy into and start practicing photography. He also became a manufacturer of photographic equipment, set up galleries all around the United States. We believe that Samuel and Marcus met John Plumb probably in New York City when Marcus, who was 11 years older than Samuel, started a gallery in New York City in 1848 that ran until 1857. And at that time in 1857, Samuel Root here moved to Dubuque with his wife and set up his galleries here in Dubuque and would practice photography the rest of his life here in Dubuque. Very interesting if you're familiar with a lot of the stereo views of Dubuque that Samuel Root took in the second half of the 19th century. There's almost always a German short-haired dog, Root's dog, in a lot of his pictures of the landscape pictures of Dubuque. In 1854, it was no different, obviously, as you can see in this particular drawing. Now, this picture here is a picture of Samuel Root playing chess against Samuel Root. And this is a picture taken in Dubuque. This could perhaps be one of the very first examples of a Photoshop image And as you look at the image itself closely, you can actually see some dividing line here in light where he exposed two different images together. I'm not sure who took the photograph for him, but it's a neat little example of one of the first examples of touching up and modifying an image to make it look other than natural or real. And as we were going through, what I started to discover was Samuel Root actually took a lot of well-known portrait photographs of a lot of individuals. This is it's not a lithograph, it's a wood cut carving of Henry Clay from an 1854 book, which was 2 years after Henry Clay died, but the image is actually from a daguerreotype taken by Samuel Root of Henry Clay around 1849, 1850, right around the Compromise of 1850, which Clay was very well ingrained in. So this is the actual daguerreotype that Root took. When Root passed away in 1889, he still had this in his possession according to the Dubuque Daily Telegraph. So it was a prized possession of his that he showed often in his gallery here in Dubuque of the great statesman Henry Clay. Root also took this picture, rather famous picture, P.T. Barnum and General Tom Thumb. General Tom Thumb was probably about 11 years old in this particular picture, probably taken about 1849, 1850 in the New York City studios of Samuel Root. So a very well-known picture. Root also took a picture of Jenny Lind, considered the Swedish Nightingale, an opera singer who P.T. Barnum discovered in Europe, brought to America, and she toured America. Samuel Root took the first known photograph of her that was very well known and used in America. I assume he took this picture of Barnum, established a relationship with Barnum, and then Lind got introduced to Root through Barnum, is my assumption, based off of dates. We also know that he took pictures of people like Vice President George Dallas, Edwin Forrest, an actor, and several other notables of the time that Root had taken their images that became very widely known and popular throughout the United States. Although Root himself did not reach the level of popularity as a Matthew Brady or an Alexander Gardner or even a John Plum. This is also an image taken. This image is of Bishop Matthew Simpson, who was a very well-known Methodist minister in the second half of the 19th century. He lectured all over the United States. This was actually taken in the Sanford Block here in Dubuque by Samuel Root on September 16, 1868. Bishop Simpson was in town to lecture, and so he stopped by Root's studio to get his image taken, and so this is a picture of Bishop Simpson here in Dubuque. So the Sanford Block in this particular studio would be where Cottingham and Butler is located today. So this is an image, the Bishop Simpson image is in one of the cases here today. So is this image. This is where Cottingham and Butler is located today. This is a picture of the Sanford Block with Root, with Root and Cutter's photography. So they were on the second floor there. Root would oftentimes keep down in here a box of all kinds of daguerreotypes, mostly of beautiful women that he photographed as a way to advertise. And he'd lock it up here at night, and in one of the newspapers I ran across an article where someone stole the images, and Root blamed it on one of the old lonely men in Dubuque who was walking around and decided to steal all these pictures of all these beautiful women, which was rather funny. So this Root's gallery was on the second floor. Again, this would be where Cottingham Butler is located today. His studio prior to this, because he moved here in 1867 and started with Cutter in 1868, his shop prior to that was at 166 Main Street on the southeast corner of 8th and Main. This is the northeast corner of 8th and Main Street. So he just moved right across the street. And that's important because that was part of one of the mysteries that we were trying to solve about the photograph. When was it actually taken? Did Root indeed take it, and was it taken in Dubuque? And we wanted to figure that out. So this is where Root would take his photographs. It is also interesting to note that prior to Root moving here, back before and during the Civil War, the second floor up here were the offices of the Governor Graves, which became the Iowa 1st, or part of the Iowa 1st Infantry in the Civil War. So it was in one of these rooms where William Hyde Clark and Francis J. Heron first volunteered for the Civil War, and they have been nationally recognized by the War Department as the first group or unit to volunteer for service in the Civil War prior to South Carolina seceding from the Union. So it's a rather historical building, obviously no longer exists today, but just knowing that that space, had this history, I think is also important to know. So as I was searching, again, the image of Douglas by Samuel Root kept on coming up in a variety of books. And one of the things that I had learned that I did not know was Frederick Douglass was the most photographed person of the 19th century, which surprised me. I would have thought it was Abraham Lincoln, potentially General Grant, maybe Mark Twain. But I wouldn't have guessed Frederick Douglass. But indeed it was Frederick Douglass. I think Lincoln had about 140 known images taken of him. Douglas, we have about 165 known images taken of him. There was a newer image just recently discovered here in the last year or so at the Gilder Lehrman Museum in the New York City Historical Society archives. My wife and I actually, we were there last September. We went to visit the actual Samuel Root Frederick Douglass image. This is just a photograph action. And I'll pass it around. I'm going to skip you guys because I know you guys have seen them already. My in-laws. And we got to actually see the image and hold it in person. And it was just fabulous. The images that we have here do not do it justice because it is such a crisp, such a clear image of Douglas and very impressive image. But we were interested in finding that Douglas was indeed the most photographed person. And so there's a lot of books that are geared towards just the images and what do the images mean. Douglas was very keen on getting his image taken any chance he got. He believed the more people could see an articulate African American, the more he could combat the caricatures that were in the newspapers and in the stories of the Negro being imbeciles, being uneducated, not having the ability to rise as high as whites. And Douglas knew that if he could get out in front of people and speak, and if people could see his image, it would start doing away with some of that caricature of the Negro. And so this book talks quite a bit about every image taken in Douglas, including the one taken by Samuel Root. And here it has it, February, March of 1867. And this is where they talk about it potentially being from his speech in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Well, in 1867, we know that Samuel Root moved from the southeast corner of Main Street, 166 Main Street, over to the Sanford block or the northwest corner. And we know that the image Root is stamped 166 Main Street, so the timing there is a little off for it to be actually taken at 166 Main Street. 1867, you just start getting into that period when he had already moved or was in the process of moving. And then there's a book here about Frederick Douglass and Herman Melville. A lot of people don't know Herman Melville spent a summer on his uncle's farm in Galena, Illinois in 1840. And a lot of his writings in later years were influenced by the Midwestern hills and fields and whatnot around Galena, a time that he cherished. But in this particular book, they try to overanalyze every single Douglas image. And here they talk about the image potentially being taken in 1890s, but potentially 1880. Well, as you start looking at images of Douglas through the years, you can tell based off of skin, based off of hair color. People are getting older, so you can't stick in a picture you think was 1890 and the guy looks 20 years younger than the pictures taken in that time frame. So we knew that it probably wasn't taken around this time frame. And as they went through this was something else that I found a little bit ridiculous. They talked about the Freudian implications of the posturing of Douglas in the Samuel Root image. What was the meaning as you look at the image and you go through and you look at it? Douglas is holding a cane, and at the top of the cane it's gold. It's a gold knob on top of it. So they're talking about the Freudian implications of that and the phallic implications of that, and it's just ludicrous. What it was a good photographer that knew that would help create a much better image by having that gold piece, take away from part of that ugliness of portraits, which was people in black, and half the picture is just all black. So I found that a little disturbing. But what I started to discover then was that Douglas did indeed get his image taken by Samuel Root in Dubuque, and I discovered that Douglas spoke in Dubuque 3 different times that we know of for sure. He could have spoke more. We don't know, but we know for sure that he was here and spoke on April 20th, 1866. And that is when I believe that image was actually taken. It was on April 20th, 1866. All the indications are is that that's the specific date and time. And it would have been at the southeast location where the Steel Center and Steel Financial Management is on their 2nd floor. It's right at that corner is where Douglas would have sat for Root to get his image taken. We also know by that clipping that March 3rd, 1868, Douglas also spoke in Dubuque. And then we also know that he spoke a 3rd time in 1869 on March 4th. So I write a little bit about what he spoke about in the articles. I'm not going to go really in depth. The first time he visited, though, Dubuque, this is a Google map of Dubuque, so this would be Main Street, this would be Five Flags. So right up here, number 2 and 4, number 4 is the northeast corner of 8th and Main, or the Sanford block. Number 2 would be where the Steel Center is on the southeast corner. The first time Douglas spoke in Dubuque, he spoke at Julian Hall, which is number 1 here, which is located at 5th and Locust Street. Today it's a parking lot right behind the Redstone. Used to be the old parking lot for the postal office there. He spoke there because the Athenaeum, which is now Five Flags Theater, was booked that night. They were actually doing Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Douglas ended up speaking at the Julian Hall and having this picture made right there. I believe he came in the morning of April 20th, or about 20 passenger trains arrived daily in Dubuque about then. I believe he came in that morning. We know by the newspapers he spoke that night at Julian Hall. He spoke on the need for Reconstruction. He spoke on the fact that the Freedmen's Bureau bill had just been defeated 2 months earlier. The nation was at that time starting to talk heavily about impeaching a president, President Andrew Johnson. So he's here to talk about that and about African American suffrage, the need to pass the 14th and the 15th Amendment. When he came and spoke in 1868, his speech was entitled Self-Made Man. He had written a book and developed a lecture on the self-made man back in 1854, and he had been giving that speech periodically for quite some time. So it was a very popular speech, very well received. Both speeches were very well received in Dubuque, and the Daily Herald even complimented Douglas as being more articulate and more tuned in on the need for reconciliation and for African American suffrage than any white man or any black person in the world has articulated up to this point. So they were very impressed by his arguments, and the sound logic must have been very straightforward. Unfortunately, there's no print of his speech, so we don't know what he spoke about at any of his lectures for sure and what exactly he said. We do know that his 1869 speech was on William of Orange, or William the Silent, and the Netherlands 80-year religious war. It was not very well received, and although it was well attended, basically the Dubuque Daily Times, the competitor to the Dubuque Daily Herald, which the Times was a Republican-leaning paper, the Herald was a Democratic-leaning paper. The Times said Douglas is very knowledgeable, but should speak to lecturing on things that he knows about and not things like the Netherlands 80-year war. So that was the locations. The second and third time that Douglas spoke in Dubuque was at the Athenaeum. That was the premier theater. There were multiple theaters in Dubuque, and there were lecture series and lecture halls all around the United States. Dubuque was no different. The Young Man's Literary Association sponsored a lot of lecture series, and you would get politicians, military people, actors, poets, Europeans on tour of America that would tour on this lecture circuit and come to these theaters or lectoriums and give speeches in these towns, whether it was on a subject like William the Silent and the Netherlands War, or whether it was on a political topic of the day like Reconstruction. And again, two of his three speeches were sponsored by the Young Man's Literary Association. And if you think about it, they were the precursor and the genesis for Carnegie-Stout Public Library. It was their catalog of books that was donated when Andrew Carnegie donated the $25,000 for building this building, and Henry Stout donated the property. And so today what we're doing here is kind of an extension of what started with Douglas and the Young Men's Literary or Library Association back in the 1860s. And that's these lecture series here. So we talked about the clipping and this particular image. I think people try to describe these images, and that's part of the historian's job, is not just talking about the time and the place and those types of things, but attributing certain aspects to an image and kind of evaluating it. And the way I evaluate this image is that Douglas, first off, I see nothing phallic in the fact that the knob of his cane happens to be placed where it happens to be placed. I just think he sat, if you look at a lot of his images over time, this pose of him sitting and this profile is very common. I think Samuel Root was familiar with that, knew that the gold would help take away from this being all black, and I think it was just placed there as a photographic artist more so than anything. I also think if you look at the image, Douglas looks very relaxed. He looks very dapper. He's not clinching the rod or the cane. He has a very light grip, which means he's very calm, very in control of himself. And you can tell he's a man who understands that everybody's watching him, and that people are trying to find any small fault in him whatsoever, in look, in speech, in thought, that they can not only ascribe to him, but his entire race. Because at this time, in the 1860s, we were, at the end of the Civil War, in the middle of Reconstruction, and we were still trying to figure out what was the role of the African American in American society, and how did the African American compare to any other human being in potential, in talent, in skill, in ability. And it was a real conversation. And Douglas was at the forefront of that battle. And I think, again, he went out and sought to be photographed and was very keenly aware of his appearance and how he was being photographed. There's only one known image of Douglas where he's either smiling or cracking a grin. He's with one of his nephews or grandsons, I believe. Otherwise, every picture you see of him, he's not smiling. And that's by intention, because he knows the seriousness of the topic that he represents and what people try to ascribe to him in these caricatures that show up in the newspapers, whether they be descriptive or images and cartoons drawn of him. And you saw a lot of that. Even the Dubuque Daily Herald would be very vicious in some of their dealings with Douglas, whether they're describing a Manchester talk, an Anamosa talk, or his talk in Dubuque, they would refer to him using the N-word and lambaste him. So it's amazing that he was able to keep his composure, and he just looks like a steel lion in this picture, in my opinion. Talk to my wife in the back there. Like I said, we got to actually hold the original image. It's a very crisp. This image here does not do it justice. It's just so impressive, and he's such an impressive man. So I want to tell you a little bit. We've been talking a lot about the research and the history and kind of the links. And we've talked a little bit now about Frederick Douglass and the actual speech. I want to tell you a little bit about the national encampment. From the story side of it, not just from the discovery side of it. So, with the national encampment, some of the questions I first had really was about the picture here. Who won it? What did they win it for? You know, we had the inscription on the front, so we had some general information, but who was the Bush Slavs, and why did they win it? The other question I had remaining was, where is Camp Henderson specifically? Was it indeed the old driving park and fairgrounds, i.e. Nutwood Park, or was it some other location? Was it perhaps out at Eagle Point and it just wasn't that specific spot? Someone else had even suggested that it could have been along Rockdale Road, which I think was dismissed pretty immediately. So we had, first off, the need to figure out where was the actual encampment itself. And we had these three actual images from Samuel Root of the encampment itself. And so, you know, you can see some homes and some buildings that can be used as landmarks to try to figure out specifically where was this picture taken from, so where was the actual encampment located, those types of things. And then you can also see landmarks as far as the land goes. You can see that the hill comes down here. It's hard to see in this image, but you can also see the hill comes down here, so there's a third one in between, which indicates that this is a valley that goes up into a valley and gets lost back there. So, like I said, I reached out to Randy Lyon and Mike Gibson, and people kept on pointing to Nutwood Park. That's where the old fairground and driving park was. So I had pulled up this from the Iowa State Historical Society. This is an old aerial imagery from 1930, and this is actually the 1 mile oval of the old Nutwood Park. This is Melody Mills, for those of you that remember Melody Mills. And then this is JFK Road, and then this would have been right here going up Union Hollow. Today, this is where the Northwest Arterial runs. So I started looking, and again, I went out and I looked along the bluffs on both sides of Kohler Valley here to try to align the landmarks in any one of these pictures, trying to figure out where it was. We also had from the Morris College in the center up there, known images of Nutwood Park. So this is the amphitheater in Nutwood Park. Here you can see it looking south, and you can see the brewery. And we know Nutwood Park was unveiled in 1894. So if the encampment was in 1884, was it at Nutwood Park? So I started searching DuBuqueEncyclopedia.org, a site I love and get lost on all the time. And started looking and searching for driving park, fairground, those types of things, and found 5 or 6 different articles that there was a little confusion between what was what. And we discovered there was that Nutwood Park was built on the old driving park and the old fairgrounds. And that was just down the road from the Shooting Society, like it is today. What we didn't understand was that at one point, the German Shooting Society, the driving park and the fairgrounds were in one location and then moved. And the proximity of the fairground to the German shooting park, which was always the description of its location, remained the same, but what we didn't know was they both moved around the same time. So the question was, when did they move and where were these locations? So what we discovered was there was an old driving park. So Mike, I believe you sent me this map, and on it said DuBuque Driving Park, half-mile track, and it shows the track out there along JFK or Highway 52 by John F. Kennedy Road and John Deere Road here. So that's this right up here in the upper hand corner, DuBuque Driving Park. And then I noticed on this map down here by Bird, and it said Old Driving Park. I'm like, okay. Well, these are railroad buildings. This is the railroad, and the railroad grounds here marked on the map. Why does it say Old Driving Park? So we had a mystery. So I'm searching other maps, and I'm looking at some United States Geological Service maps today that they have online today. So this is a 2017 map that shows the Northwest Arterial and John F. Kennedy Road and John Deere Road. It says Fairground at Peru Road by Flex Steel. I thought, okay, this seems a little odd. I'm a cartographer. I work and have been working for a mapping company for over 20 years, so I know a little bit about cartography and maps, and I work with a lot of maps. And I've seen other maps too from the USGS that call this Union Hollow Road, refer to the old references of these landmarks from when the maps were first made back in the 19th century. A lot of that has been carried forward, especially by the USGS. So now I started wondering, was the old driving park that Nutwood Park was built on a different old driving park than the old driving park that the encampment was on? So now we had a real mystery. It seemed that there were two different old driving parks. And so I also ran across this image. This is Flex Steel, back to Flex Steel. This is the Minnesota Northwestern Railroad line here, and this is their stop at Peru Road, and it said on it, Fairgrounds. So here's another example that clearly the first fairgrounds in Dubuque had to be located there, or must have been, or potentially was. So I've researched fairgrounds, and Dubuque had a lot of fairgrounds. There were industrial fairs, agricultural fairs, state fairs, all kinds of fairs that were in Dubuque from the 1850s on. So there were different locations. Matthias Ham had one out at Eagle Point. There was a fairground out there that there was an agricultural fair in 1863, I think, held on that property. And then I found the Interstate Fair, which was located actually at the address was Kohler Valley and Peru Road, which would be Central Avenue and Peru Road, or right out here where Flex Steel was. So I started putting it together, and what we came to discover was that the very first fairground and formal horse race track or driving park in Dubuque was indeed located out on Peru Road in East 32nd Street. So this is Central Avenue, this is East and West 32nd Street. So this basically was the layout of Camp Henderson. This was the horse oval. This was the tower, this was the amphitheater, and in some of the images you can see this big building here, which means Samuel Root took his images from right about here on the hill. And it turns out when you take those images out and you go up by Family Beer Store out there, the old Family Beer Store, and you stop on Central and look, it lines up perfectly. So we found the match to the images. So we knew where the photographers were. We started to know now where that first fairgrounds and horse track was, driving park was. Did some further investigation, came to discover that the German Shooting Society used to be at, I think it was either 27th or 30th in Jackson. And so the first driving park, he came down Jackson Street, and Jackson actually ended at Peru Road, and we had the open gates to the fairgrounds, and the horse race track was right there. And everybody described the fairgrounds or the driving park just beyond the Shooting Society. Well, in 1886, the Minnesota and Northwestern Railroad announced that they were going to come in and build a new line heading north to St. Paul. And it was going to cut through the German Shooting Society, and it was going to cut through the fairground. So in 1887, the German Shooting Society moved from Jackson Street to its current location on Sageville Road or Highway 52 North. That same year, the old driving park had actually closed down in either 1885 or 1886. 1884, they had the National Encampment there, and they also had an interstate fair there, and some circuses and some other things. In 1883, the people that owned the fairgrounds actually tried to sell it to the Dubuque City Council because they constantly had flooding from the B branch, ironically. The City Council wouldn't buy it because of the B branch and the flooding issues that they had, because they knew it would take an engineering nightmare to clean it up and fix it. So in 1887, a group of Dubuquers got together and incorporated a new Dubuque driving park. And in 1889, they opened it up out there where Nutwood Park eventually would be. So there was the Dubuque Driving Park that was at Peru Road and Central Avenue there from 1862 to about 1885. Then there was a 2-year break. Then they rebuilt. The original one was a quarter-mile racetrack. The second one they built then out there where Nutwood Park eventually would be, they built as a half-mile track that opened in 1890. Then that closed down and was turned into a 1-mile track, and the Nutwood Park and all the amphitheaters and buildings were built for that, and that opened up in 1894. So with that, we discovered then the history of the location of the true Camp Henderson, but also the Dubuque driving parks and its history. Now, I know Randy Lyon is currently going through a process of writing about Nutwood Park and the history there. And it was rather timely that he and I and our research kind of came together to clarify that and clean up some of the articles also that weren't necessarily wrong, but had some allusions to one of the other parks in the articles on encyclopedia.org. So we think we've cleaned up all that history to reference the right tracks, the right mileages, the right locations for these different stories. But that leaves me then with 2 last remaining questions. Now the first one was about the nature of the encampment, and then the history, which we'll close on, of the picture itself. So the National Encampment was the largest military encampment since the Civil War. After the Civil War, it was not uncommon for National Guards, state militias, during and right after the war, but National Guard shortly after they changed the name, to get together in state encampments, to come together to drill, practice, just like the National Guard does today. You know, a weekend every month or every other month, you know, you go off to Fort Des Moines or wherever, and you get together and you drill. So that was not uncommon. In 1883, it had been suggested that they do a National Guard encampment, and they chose Nashville, Tennessee to hold it. And they selected the head of the Iowa National Guard, Brigadier Charles Bentley of Dubuque, to organize and head up that national encampment in Nashville. So Bentley did that. He also held the Iowa National Guard encampments in Des Moines, in which he would invite members of the federal units from Fort Omaha to come as observers and observe the Iowa National Guard encampments. So Bentley had this idea, along with some other federal Army officers, after the 1883 Nashville encampment. Why don't we do a national encampment where we bring federal troops and National Guard troops from multiple states together and drill together, share information, techniques, and equipment? It had not happened prior to this. So Secretary of War Robert Todd Lincoln had ordered William Powell, Captain Powell from 4th U.S. Infantry out of Fort Omaha, to work with General Bentley to organize this national encampment. So they did, and they held it in Dubuque in June of 1884 at the first Dubuque Driving Park. So General Powell and the 4th Infantry came to Dubuque early to start setting up because they needed to find a location. They settled on the fairgrounds. They needed to develop all the drilling techniques and competitions that they were going to hold. And then they needed to develop and organize a sham battle at the end so they could actually put forth some of these drilling techniques and do a mock war, as it were. So they actually built a Fort DuBuque, that was going to be the centerpiece of the battle on the final day of the week of encampments. So on the hill right above Flexsteel, they built Fort DuBuque. And Fort Dubuque was 100 feet long, triangled, 4 feet high, made out of wood encampment that they built the week before the encampment. They surrounded it with a couple 30-inch cannon and a couple 12-inch howitzers. And it was flew the 9th Iowa Infantry Civil War battle flag as its flag over top of the fort. And so they had the fort built, and ironically, it happens to be the fort is on the same site where the Ku Klux Klan used to burn crosses on the north end of Dubuque back in the early part of the 20th century. So they had the fort ready. This was advertised nationally. So troops came in from the Treadmont Rifles from St. Louis, the Mobile Rifles from Mobile, Alabama, the National Rifles from Washington, D.C. You had the 4th and 5th U.S. Artillery brought all their heavy cannon to Dubuque. The 4th U.S. Infantry, that entire regiment came to Dubuque. And there were all kinds of National Guard units from all over the Midwest and the United States that came to Dubuque, as well as about 20 to 30,000 visitors. It was very much a carnival-like atmosphere. Dubuque census in 1880, Dubuque was a population of 23,000, so for a week we had over 43,000 people in a city of 23,000. So it was crazy. They came by boat, by horse, they walked, and they came by train, mostly by train. So on the first day, on Tuesday, they had a big parade that ran from 1st Street all the way down to 17th Street along Main Street. That was the number of units. They had cavalry, they had all the cannon, all the soldiers march. There were 7 different military bands and 4 different drum corps in Dubuque. So all week long, you heard military bands playing all over the place, marching around downtown Dubuque. Concerts were constantly held in parks. Back then, roller rinks were very popular. Dubuque had 2 or 3. So they had roller rinks, had different things going on every night, military balls, concerts, roller skating shows that were like ice skating, the Dance of the Broom, the Jenny sisters performed. So I can only imagine they had broomsticks out there, and they were doing the Dance of the Broomstick is what it was called, on roller skates. It's neat when you read the newspapers because not only do you read about all the drilling and the different teams that won their drill competitions and the different military units, you also read about all the people that came to Dubuque for this. E. Kirby Smith, who was a famous Confederate general who commanded the last surrendering Confederate army of the Civil War. He came up to Dubuque for it as an observer. General John E. Smith of Galena, who spent a military career, came over from Galena as a representative of the U.S. 14th Infantry and observed. General John Gibbon came to Dubuque. General Gibbon was the commander of the U.S. 7th Infantry. General Gibbon was also the commander originally of the Black Hat Brigade, which consisted of a variety of soldiers from Grant County, Wisconsin. Later on, they would be renamed the Iron Brigade. So it was an opportunity for a lot of Grant County and regional veterans from the Civil War and the Iron Brigade to get back together with their old commander, John Gibbon, who also fought at Gettysburg. He was also the commander of the U.S. 7th Infantry that arrived at Little Bighorn just in time to bury General Custer in the 7th Cavalry. That had happened less than a decade earlier when he was here in Dubuque. So General Gibbon and a host of other, several governors from states were in Dubuque to observe. As you read the newspapers, the police beat was always very interesting to read. As you can imagine, 20,000 people come to a community of 20,000, not a lot of places to stay, a lot of opportunities, so a lot of pickpockets, a lot of thievery going on. There was one story of a gentleman who was caught in the grandstands of the amphitheater, and if it weren't for the local constable getting there in time, they said a rope had been produced. They were going to hang the gentleman for stealing a pocketbook out of a lady's purse in the grandstands. The city issued gambling licenses for the week, and so they had gambling at the fairgrounds. They also had a circus going on at the north end of the fairgrounds that came into town during the encampment. And then several saloons downtown also had gambling licenses that were issued for the week. Of course, the religious establishment and the temperance movement in Dubuque were in arms about that. We're totally against 24-hour gambling and drinking in Dubuque and the debauchery that would ensue or potentially ensue, they feared. General Powell, in his report to the Department of War about the encampment, said he was very pleased because alcohol and drinking establishments surrounded the encampment, but all the military, both federal and state, were extremely well behaved, and no instances arose with any of them, which he attributed to the fact that the regular army was present. So it was very interesting to learn about that and what all went in and how much work went into creating the encampment. This is just an aerial view of Flex Steel and kind of the layout of where the encampment would have been.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
Did you go up on North End Autos Hill?
I did not get up on,
Okay, yeah.
on that, Tom, unfortunately. These here, I was just, I didn't go in depth, but here I was kind of laying out. So this line right here would be Central Avenue. This line would be Peru Road. This would be Jackson Street today. And the red line is where the railroad eventually came through, this particular image.
What are the buildings there? Can you tell us about the encampment?
So as far as the building goes, these were all part of the fairgrounds and for horse racing. The tents were all the different soldiers and units that came in. But this was a standard hall that was part of the fairgrounds, as was this. I believe this was the stable building as part of the primary fairground. Right in here would have been the Jackson Street entrance, and then there was a Fuller Valley Street entrance over here to the fairgrounds and the racetrack. And then there were some structures, some building structures right in there for like tickets and selling food and those types of things. And then I know the Grand Army of the Republic, they had a post right in here. So when you first came in, if you were a veteran, you could sign in, those types of things. If there was anybody you wanted to meet up with, you could put your name in, those types of things. And then in some of these images, I was just trying to lay out kind of a perspective of how it lays out. So again, you can see Peru Road, Jackson Street, the Jackson Street entrance that's discussed in the newspaper articles. There was this fence that encircled the entire fairgrounds and drive-in park here. You see it in the other image that the County Historical Society has of the actual racetrack. You can see that the fence is on that side as well. And you also saw it in Alexander Gardner or Simplot's drawing as well. This image helped me really establish where and when things were. So again, this would be the east side, northeast side of the horse track, and you can see the outer fence of the fairgrounds there. But I show the Peru Road, the Jackson Street entrance where it comes up, but I also show over here, this would be Kohler Valley Street or Central Avenue, and then the Heim House and the Heim Brickyard. And that really, the Heim House and Heim Brickyard really helped me zero in to know kind of and place this image. So I found some other images of the Heim Brickyard from the other perspective, so you can kind of see the Heim Halls, the brickyard, the brewery, and then I aligned those here too. So I wanted to validate that in the image of the horse track that this house indeed was where it was located. So I used some of these other images to kind of triangulate where for sure was this image located and taking those types of things. So we've been through this here. I just want to kind of close up on the picture itself, because that's really what started me down this road last March. And that's winning this picture. So everything we talked about here, I kind of learned along the way in bits and pieces and chunks as I went. But I wanted to know more about the picture. So what I had discovered was that the picture was won by the Bush Zouaves, which were part of the 8th Missouri Infantry. So they were part of the Missouri National Guard, but they were a specific militia unit that was created and attached themselves to the 8th Infantry. I also discovered that the Bush Zouaves were directly related to and affiliated with Adolphus Bush, the beer magnate of St. Louis. Actually, the day of the end of the encampment, Adolphus Bush stepped on a steamer for Germany to start planning a tour of Germany with the Bush Zouaves. So Anheuser-Busch, the Busch Brewery in St. Louis, was actually a sponsor of the Bush Zouaves. When they were here for the encampment, the Dubuque Brewing Association actually hosted and housed the Bush Zouaves during their week here in Dubuque in 1884. So not only is it a presentation picture, it's a beer picture. So in my research, they talked how this particular picture came with 6 goblets, drinking goblets, and it was provided by A.R. Knights and Company, who was a wholesaler jeweler of diamonds and silverware here in Dubuque in the 700 block of Dubuque on Main Street. I believe today where that would be is right in the town clock area. Hardick has his office buildings there, right across from NICC. I believe that's where the jewelry store was actually located. And for the week, he had the picture set up in the display window, and then once the Zouaves on, I think it was Wednesday, won their drill competition, they then inscribed it, presented to the Bush Zouaves and the date for it. So Alonzo Knights was the jeweler who provided this particular picture for that. And as I said, it was discovered in a box in a storage garage at an auction in Oklahoma City, so it was forgot in time. 2 people. And let me see.
Is that all silver, Jen, or is it?
It's silver plated. Inside there is a ceramic bowl inside to hold whatever liquids you may be enjoying at the time. It's rather heavy, which is why it's on the pouring stand, which was a rather nice idea. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. But like I said, the stories themselves, that's not what today was about. So you can find both the stories of Frederick Douglass and his orations in Dubuque and the National Encampment with much more detail about the events themselves by either going to encyclopediadubuque.org and searching Douglass or searching Camp Henderson. It will come up. Or you can go to a website I have called thelensofhistory.com. Go to the post section, you'll see the articles there. What I've been trying to do as a historian is do more citing of facts to demonstrate that this Dubuque folklore is actually true. That's what I'm trying to do with right now. If you know anything about Jesse James being in Dubuque, I'm trying to find specific mentions in newspapers or facts about things like that. These are very well cited. I have in the documents and on encyclopedia.org all the citations, all the newspapers, all the reports that help demonstrate and proof out this particular history of Dubuque. I've also provided these websites and the search names just on little pieces of paper here, so you don't have to write it down. If you want to grab it, take it home with you so you can look it up. You're more than welcome to. Also have some of the artifacts up here I ask that you don't touch, but you're more than welcome to take a look at. They're just artifacts that I've acquired here over the last few years related to this. But with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you all have. So.
It's interesting, the Nutsford Park became the first city airport.
Yeah.
It was called the Nutsford Airport.
Sure.
Same location again.
John, are the roots buried here in Dubuque?
He is not. His wife was from, and that's an interesting subject too that I briefly touch on in the article. Samuel Root's wife was from Rochester, New York, and Frederick Douglass spent a lot of time living in Rochester, New York. He ran his newspaper, the North Star, out of Rochester, New York. So there's some question whether they knew each other before Root came to Dubuque, or before Douglass came to Dubuque. So Root's wife is buried in Rochester, and Root, their son, only son, was killed during the Civil War. And Root he retired in 1882, sold his photograph shop here in Dubuque, but he still lived here. And he was visiting his family back in Rochester, his wife's in-law, or family, I should say, his in-laws, in 1889, and he passed away in Rochester. So they just kept him there, and they buried him next to his wife in Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York. Consequently, 6 years later, Frederick Douglass dies and is buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York as well. So they're buried in the same cemetery in Rochester. And I believe Marcus Aurelius Root, Samuel's older brother, who is looked at as one of the pioneering photographers of American photography, I think he's buried in Philadelphia.
Was Root's son buried in Rochester too?
No, he's buried in Ohio, where the Roots were actually born and raised in Ohio, and that's where their family was originally from. And then as Marcus got into photography, he moved around to different cities that would help support, this burgeoning industry. So Philadelphia and New York, and then he lived in South Carolina, I believe, too, for a while. We do wonder, Cliff Cranick and I speak about this, we wonder if Samuel Root was drawn to Dubuque because of John Plum Jr., because John Plum Jr. Was the father of American photography. The concept of national photographic galleries and those types of things, and marketing such a thing and franchising them were his concepts. He pioneered that long before Matthew Brady or Alexander Gardner. Very well known, manufactured, sold cameras and equipment. So we think that the Roots and the Plums might have known each other, and that Root was attracted to Dubuque because of John Plum, although John had committed suicide by that point. Yes? Well, we're not sure exactly. Sure. The question is, when did Root take the picture of P.T. Barnum and General Tom Thumb? Well, we believe that picture was taken probably 1849 or 1850. General Thumb, you can see in the picture, is still a kid. I believe he's 10 or 11 years old. There's some images of him at the age of 10 where it's spot on. So that would have been, he was born in like 1838, so probably realistically, Samuel Root and Marcus Aurelius Root started a New York City Broadway photography shop in 1848 that Samuel Root ran until 1857 when he moved to Dubuque. So realistically, it was sometime probably between 48 and 50. We know Jenny Lind came to America in between 50 and 52. And if our suspicion is right that Root first got introduced to Barnum, and then Barnum introduced Root to Lind, and he took that famous picture that it was well known around America of Jenny Lind, that then the Barnum picture was probably 48, 49, the Lind picture was probably 50, 51, maybe 52, And the Bayard Taylor, who was an American poet and laureate, also knew P.T. Barnum and won a writing competition regarding Jenny Lind. So we're assuming that Taylor also got introduced to Root through P.T. Barnum. One of the things I need to investigate, because I just thought about it here this weekend, is where was P.T. Barnum's offices in New York City in relation to Root's galleries? I'm going to guess they're in the same neighborhood, probably close together, but I haven't discovered that yet.
Thank you for untangling the land use, the complicated land use around the fairgrounds and all of that. I've often wondered about that because it's so many layers and so forth. And then finally the railroad, and there was a fairground station. But that's how you showed it in the photograph.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Any other questions, comments, stories?
This is really
Sure, sure.
What is a driving park? I didn't know what was it used for?
Horse racing.
Oh, for horses?
Yes,
Oh, okay.
so, and they would open it up to the public, so you could come out and race your own carriages or horses, race against your friends. They would have, when they would have events, they would have competition with people running against a horse, stuff like that. The second one was a half mile, and then that only existed for a couple of years, and they turned it into a mile. But horse racing around Dubuque, and really, horse racing was the #1 sport in America in the 19th century. It was the only sport that you read about regularly in the newspapers. You know, General Grant was got a speeding ticket around the White House because he was always out racing up and down in his carriages. He liked to go fast. North Grand View, for the longest time, people used to drag race their horse and buggies along North Grand View. Molo used to own the Flora Park area, and you got the Molo House, and there used to be a horse track up there where he would run their trotters and whatnot. The Stout family, Henry and Frank Stout, who built Nutwood Park and owned the horse Nutwood, they had their horse track up there. Carter and Asbury, the sisters' grounds there. The horse track was around the lake, and the famous horse Nutwood is actually supposed to be buried in the woods there.
Just where they cut the trees down.
I didn't know they were cutting the trees down, but they should look out for
The
it.
sword went through there.
Any other questions?
It's an unusual name, though, what Paul was saying that, right?
Well, that was just the common name that you would call a horse race park, was a driving park. Because usually horse racing wasn't mounted on the back of the horse. Usually it was kind of the...
With carriages.
Exactly. Exactly so. So I assume it just dealt with that. Any other questions or anything anybody would like to add? Yes.
The pictures of Main Street showed the tracks for the trolley there, and that appeared to be brick. Was that they had to make it solid to hold the tracks apparently, right?
Yeah.
When did they start building streets like that?
You know,
We have alleys like that.
I'm not sure when they first started doing the brick streets. They started laying trolley tracks probably in the late 1850s, but most of them were horse-drawn. And obviously, you know, with dirt roads and that, I'm sure, you know, heavy rains and especially with winters around here, you would have shifting in that with the mud. And my guess is that, you know, the concept of laying the brick around it was to help prevent the rails from you know, separating or spreading further than what they needed to be to make sure the trolley stays on the tracks, those types of things. But I'm not sure. I haven't investigated when exactly they started that.
It was hard to get rid of the horses. After the Second World War, they were still using them.
Sure.
My father-in-law quit when there was a name or dairy because he wasn't going to maintain any of that anymore. He had used horses all the war.
Sure.
And they used it all through the war. And you can use it.
Well, A.A. Cooper here thought Loris has a collection of his images. I know the Dubuque County Historical Society does. I know the Iowa Historical Society does. I know the New York City Library has a large collection of his images as well. That is very impressive. We visited here this summer as well when we were in New York City. I've acquired through Cliff Tranick his collection of Samuel Root images, which is over 100 images as well, that I want to start going in and kind of indexing, exploring, researching further, and really start telling Root's story. Because here's a man who isn't that well known outside of people who really do in-depth research on early 19th century photographers, or if you're familiar with just the images he produced at DuBuque. But not a lot is known about the man, and he's taken a lot of well-known photographs, and he really should be celebrated. And I think DuBuque, especially when you look at Root and you look at Plum, Dubuque was the epicenter of early American photography. Plum's buried here in Dubuque, and it really needs to be celebrated. So that's one of the things I want to do besides addressing a lot of those little loose ends of history's mystery. So to that end, if you do know anything about Rathbone or Jesse James or anything else, any stories that you heard or folklore, that's where you start finding morsels of truth that you start following up on and start finding the truth. Feel free to let me know. I'd be happy to hear, talk about it, and follow up on it. We do have over on the table here, they have some pens and some evaluation forms. The library does, they hold these things. They just like to get people's feedback. What did you like about today, the facilities, those types of things? Should we continue doing these types of things at Carnegie-Stout? So please do take the time to fill out a questionnaire and leave your thoughts and opinions. Other than that, I greatly appreciate you sitting and listening to me here today. So thanks.
Don't hesitate to stop by the reference